Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. And as we're all getting ready for the program, we do appreciate that last check that cell phones have been turned off, especially here in the room. For those who are recording our events, we will post the program within 24 hours on our homepage for everyone's future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is Dr. Niall Gardner, director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He also served as a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of Washington policy world for over a decade and is a leading expert on U.S.-UK special relationship. Dr. Gardner is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thanks very much, John. Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Our speaker today is Dr. Robin Harris, Senior Visiting Fellow in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. I had the privilege of working with Robin in Lady Thatcher's private office prior to joining Heritage. Robin's personal knowledge of the Iron Lady's life and achievements is formidable and is presented in compelling fashion in his new book, Not for Turning the Life of Margaret Thatcher, which has been described by a British newspaper as the political biography of the decade. Between 1978 and 1990, Robin Harris worked continuously for either the British government or for the Conservative Party, notably as Special Advisor at the Treasury, Special Advisor at the Home Office, Director of the Conservative Research Department, and as a member of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Downing Street Policy Unit. In these capacities, he became a regular speechwriter for the then Prime Minister. By the end of Thatcher's premiership, he was probably the most trusted member of her Downing Street policy team. As a key advisor after she left office, Robin drafted the 2 volumes of her autobiography, The Downing Street Years and The Path to Power, as well as a highly influential book on foreign policy, statecraft, Strategies for a Changing World, and continue to see her regularly in her retirement. Robin Harris is the author of several books, including his widely praised The Conservatives, A History, and Dubrovnik, A History. He is also a frequent contributor to leading British publications, including the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail, and the Spectator. Dr. Harris is a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, received for political and public service, and has been awarded the Croatian Republic's Order of the Morning Star for services to culture. He received a first-class degree in modern history and then a DPhil on French history, both at Exeter College, Oxford. He also won the Oxford University Gibbs Prize in history. We are delighted and honoured to have Robin Harris join us today. Thank you.
Right, you could open that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it was a stirring introduction. It was all true. But we only are as good as our last book. So I hope that you like mine. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to the Heritage Foundation for hosting and organising this event. And particularly thank you to Ed Fulner and Heritage for tolerating me for the last 5 years or so, and occasionally visiting Brit, who loves America and loves heritage. Mrs. Thatcher made many good decisions, but one of the best was to become patron of the Heritage Foundation, and another was to promote the foundation of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom within Heritage, which keeps her legacy alive and well, and that's important. So for all those reasons, I am grateful to Heritage. Well, we'll start off with a funeral. Mrs. Thatcher's funeral on Wednesday, the 17th of April this year. These grand events are done well in Britain. And we had an empire, for goodness sake, we ought to be able to do something. And St. Paul's Cathedral is a very impressive, I think a rather cold, but very impressive building. And the The political classes were all arrayed there, waiting for the beginning of the funeral. They don't always behave terribly well, these people. Nowadays they text each other. And I'm reliably informed that one woman even sold 2 dachshund puppies to her neighbour before the funeral service actually began. But anyway, the organ started up, and we moved into funereal mode. And then something almost as moving, not quite of course, but almost as moving as the later appearance of the coffin itself, was when the great doors of the cathedral were flung open, and there was an inrush of what I can only call human noise. I say human noise because just in the same way as you can't easily distinguish the 2 words jeering and cheering, you can't actually easily distinguish the 2 actualities. And if you've been in conservative, right-wing conservative politics, you're actually often more used to jeering than cheering. But it's never bothered me and didn't bother me then. But anyway, in fact, what this vast inrush of sound was the fact that thousands of people had fought their way through the very tight security which surrounded the cathedral in order to cheer Mrs. Thatcher off, because they loved her and they admired her. And this, I can tell you, was, although I suppose expected in a sort of way by me, it was very pleasant to know it, but it was certainly not expected by the British Broadcasting Company. But it was the truth. And this truth was then ratified in a statistical manner by a very interesting poll, which was done by the Sun newspaper. And the Sun interviewed the requisite number of people, and remember that people had had many years to think what they actually thought about Mrs. Thatcher. After all, she had retired in 2002. She'd left office in 1990. She was continually discussed, both for and against, in the media, so they'd really had time to reflect. And so therefore this poll means more than many polls do. And people were asked who they thought was the greatest of the 13 prime ministers Britain had had since the war. Well, she came top with 28%. Second was Churchill, 24%. Third was Tony Blair, 10%. Rather an exaggeration, I think, but anyway, there we are, it's a fact. Major, 1%, that's more or less right, I think. And David Cameron, as they say of almost every British entry into the Eurovision Song Contest, David Cameron, nul point. But anyway, the investigation went further because they wanted to know why people thought what they did of Mrs. Thatcher. And 72% thought that she stuck to what she believed in, and 66% thought that she was strong. And they also thought that Britain was much more prosperous, that it was somewhat freer, and above all, that its standing was much greater in the world. And in all those regards, I wouldn't say vox populi is always vox dei, but vox populi in this case was clearly right. Well, how I got to know her, as Niall mentioned, I was around for a long time. I survived, which is always a good start. But I started working for the Conservative Party in 1978, but I only got to know Mrs. Thatcher herself in the early 1980s when I was a special advisor. And she used to have a series of rather, as Prime Minister then, she used to have a series of rather disorganized and unsatisfactory meetings with the different political advisors, all en masse, some wanting to curry favour and some just feeling embarrassed and so on. And she and I had an argument. It was not a very important argument. On this occasion, I think she was wrong, actually, about it, but it's to do with criminal justice policy, I think. But so we had this back and forth, and she took notice. She took notice that this was this upstart who actually seemed to have a word or two to say for himself. And actually, that was often the way that you got Mrs. Thatcher's notice. You had an argument with her. And she was a good arguer. She liked an argument. And if you said something that interested her, she took an interest in you. And so from then on, from time to time, we did come across each other. And I was in the Treasury, and then I was in the Home Office at the time of the miners' strike, which was an important and difficult time. And then in 1985, the directorship of the Conservative Research Department fell vacant, and the chairman of the party and the other senior people in the party very sensibly didn't really want me. But so they said, well, perhaps they would have said this anyway, I don't know. Wanting to be transparent, as the word is, they said they must advertise this post. So she said, okay, you can advertise the post. You know, you can interview people that you want, as long as, in the end, Robin gets the job. So, of course, Robin did get the job, and Robin was very grateful for getting the job. And from 1985, when he got the job by this equal opportunities process that I have just described, she and I did actually grow quite close. And I grew particularly close, really, through helping her with her speeches. Now, with Mrs. Thatcher, speech writing was very important, not just that she thought that speeches were important, as Ronald Reagan thought speeches were important, because they knew it was important to communicate and to persuade people, but also because she used these speeches to have wide-ranging arguments in order to work out what she really thought. And not just about particularly the subject of that speech, let's say it was a domestic speech. She could also suddenly start talking about, as I remember she did, the Strategic Defence Initiative, or why some particular notion was wrong, or food surpluses, or whether interest rates were really right, and so on. So you learnt a great deal. And then, so I got to know her well, and we discussed many things. And of course, I was there when she was removed, and I made her ejection my own, because I wasn't prepared to serve under anybody else. So we both left Downing Street at broadly the same time. And after that, I helped her write her memoirs. Now, this was an important experience, not only financially useful, which is after all is important to all of us, but it was important because she discussed, again, in that way that she had with speech writing, she discussed with me her early life, and she discussed what she thought of various individuals and so on. So although I really had only got to know late Thatcher, as it were, from 1985 on, personally, I actually got from her mouth, as it were, a pretty good insight into her early life, what had brought her into politics, what she did in those early years, and so on. And this reality is, I think, expressed in the book, so that, in fact, you will find in this book that there is obviously more on the late Thatcher period, from 1985 on, than there is from the early period. On the other hand, you'll find an adequate account of the Falklands and what she thought about that in reality, and some of those who had let her down during it. And you'll find many of those sort of things, which really was, as it were, from the horse's mouth. And this, I think, does make a difference as regards the sort of book that you've got. Charles Moore, who is the official biographer of Mrs. Thatcher, a good journalist, good friend of mine, and a fine conservative, he has produced volume 1 of a magisterial work. The first volume is, I think, 860 pages, and it only goes up to 1982. And I would certainly commend this huge enterprise to you. But my own book is based on a personal experience of knowing her and sharing with her some triumphs and some disasters as well, because they both go together in politics. It's also true. I think that the role of a biographer is really not very different from that of the role of an historian. And an historian should tell the truth. Obviously, he can't tell every aspect of the truth because the book would be too long. And also, legitimately, I think if some people are still alive, there are some things you will not say. Not many things in my case, because I think many of them deserve to be said. But there is still a few things that you won't say. And as far as Mrs. Thatcher's later illness and so on is concerned, which I deal with frankly, I would never have breathed a word of that while she was alive. But when people are dead, the situation is different. And as I say, I think it was important anyway to have a proper reckoning and understanding of the reality of Thatcher. And I'll tell you why. Because I was never very worried about the left-wing image of Thatcher as the sort of mad axewoman who was destroying public services following in Reagan's wake and generally behaving in a peculiar manner under the influence of foreign, particularly American, ideologues. That is just nonsense, and nobody really believes that now, apart from a few immature students and old commies. So that really is of not great interest. There is also what I would call a right-wing view, which is good about her motives and understanding her, but sometimes doesn't actually grasp the limits to what she did and the degree of prudence and pragmatism which she showed in practice. And then there is a rather more insidious view, which I think was very evident in the wake of the funeral, actually, and that was the way in which the establishment, broadly speaking, particularly the senior people in the Conservative Party, the people who've been around somehow controlling our affairs for years and always will be until they're dead. And one somehow feels that perhaps they're still going to be around after that because they never go away. But anyway, the establishment, which had really never liked her, and indeed on many occasions, as over the turbulent miners' strike, had rather disowned her, and was really glad to see the back of her. Of course, as soon as she was dead, they wanted to absorb her, to own her, to sanitize her, and to make her part of them. Well, she wasn't part of them. I mean, she was not a left-wing radical, but she was a conservative radical, and radicalism upsets people. And the great difference between radicals in politics and ordinary, sort of old-fashioned Tories in politics, is that the old-fashioned Tories want a quiet life. They want to be something. But the radicals don't expect a quiet life, and they want to do something. She wanted to do something. She wanted to make a difference, and my goodness me, she did make a difference. Well, in the rest of what I want to say, I want to talk a little more about her character. I want to talk a little of her achievements and her legacy. Well, her character was, in some respects, simple, in some respects, complex. That's to say that she was a very direct person. She was a very honest person. She nearly always said what she thought, sometimes too often. And she would say it in her own language often. In other words, when she was away from the speechwriter, she spoke in a very direct manner. That was how she was brought up. She wasn't a London girl. She was a very well-educated and clever woman, but she wasn't a London girl, and she didn't affect to a sophistication that she didn't possess. She was a good judge of events, but not always such a good judge of people. She was a good judge of events in two respects. First of all, it's very important in politics to distinguish the big things from the small things. You have to know what's really essential, what you just have to get through. That's the first thing. But secondly, you also have to understand timing. You have to understand that you can't fight every battle at the same time because you'll lose. And she was very good on timing over a number of things. For example, dealing with the miners. The National Union of Miners had brought down the previous Conservative government. It was thought that it was impossible to bring any kind of economic rationale to mining. And also there was a tradition of violence, which is quite contrary to the rather cosy image of life down pit, which was also pretty unpleasant, actually. And they were a very dangerous opponent. And it was quite clear that you were never going to reform the trade unions as a whole, and you were never going to make Britain a place that could be prosperous and attract investment from the world as a whole until you could deal with the miners. But in 1981, a slightly inadequate Minister of Energy found himself at loggerheads with the miners and on the eve of a miners' strike. And he expected her to go ahead, but she would not go ahead because the preparations had not been made. And the crucial thing I should just say about this, I just give this as an example. The important thing is that the coal, coke, whatever it is, the fuel that you're going to use, has to be close to where you need it. The idea that you've actually got some great big pile of coal somewhere that you could use if you get it to the power station, therefore you're safe, is just rubbish. Because, of course, mass picketing would actually stop you being able to move that. So you actually have to have the coal at the place that you're going to use it. And the other thing, of course, is that the police have to be equipped to deal with what they're going to face. We weren't equipped in 1981, so she totally backed down. Totally backed down. And it was not until 1984 that she was ready for this. She didn't provoke it, but she knew it would happen. And so for a year, there was a miners' strike, which in the end failed. And if that miners' strike had not failed, Britain would not have succeeded economically. And I give you another example. The battles with Europe over our money, as she described it. She took a very, very hard line in the early 80s about getting back at least a share of what we were contributing to the European budget. They hated it. They were frightened of it. The Europeans said that it was a disgrace that she should talk about our British money when it was really theirs. And she threatened to legislate against the payment of this money and so on. But in fact, she compromised. And she compromised just at the right moment, so that in fact we got 2/3 of our contribution back. And until Tony Blair threw much of that away, that was the basis of our financial relationship in Europe. She succeeded. She was a good negotiator. As for people, well, I think that sometimes she had favourites. I suppose you might say I benefited from that, but I wasn't really a favourite in that sense. I mean, she just liked discussing things with me. But she did have favourites, and she did take against people. And when she took against people in the cabinet and so on, it was very difficult from then on, because she sometimes treated them badly. And of course, again, it's difficult perhaps to understand this, but if you and a cabinet colleague, senior cabinet colleague, have had a long-standing disagreement over some matter, and you've had an argument, and probably your support has been briefing against each other, I'm afraid these tensions do grow. And it was a weakness of hers, I think, that she allowed that sometimes to become too personal. But having said that, she was also herself extremely kind. She was one of the kindest people I've ever met, and she was thoughtful. I'm never a great admirer of people who are kind, always going around the place smiling and saying, is there anything I can do for you? I mean, the answer most of the time is no. Just let me get on with life. But an intelligent person who's kind actually really tries to find out what is wrong. If somebody is looking glum, or they're looking at, you've seen them with their wife and the wife is no longer there, around with you ask. And she was very good at doing that sort of thing. She was extremely kind to the most humble people. If you were important, watch out. But if you were an equal, then you had to look after yourself. But if you were not an equal, she was extremely considerate and kind. She was very, very fond of children, always considerate again about, what if somebody came to see her, well, are the children all right, and so on, some juice and some cakes and so on. And she was also extremely kind for people who made a mess of their lives. In politics, people are very good at making messes of their lives. I'm told it even happens in Washington. But it certainly happens in London. And so often, let's say at Christmas time, there are many people who just at Christmas, because their personal arrangements had all collapsed, as happens in life, who were on their own. And she would find out who those people were, politicians, obviously, I'm not talking about just anybody, but politicians and so on. And she would invite them, see that they were invited to Chequers for Christmas. And they would find that they had Christmas presents as well. That was the sort of person she was. Well, of course, kindness is useful, but it doesn't actually what you require to run a country. You've got to have other qualities, and she did have those qualities. As well as judgment, I would say that her main quality was courage. She's one of the bravest people that I've ever met. I think it's Aristotle says somewhere that the bravery of a woman is different from the bravery of a man. And there is something in this, but it's also true that the bravery of a politician is different, let's say, from the bravery of a frontline soldier. It's a different sort of bravery, but it is a real sort of bravery. But I should say of her that she had physical courage and not just moral courage. Moral courage is obviously the most important thing in politics, but physical courage too. It took a lot of physical courage to go to Northern Ireland at the time of the Troubles, down to Armagh when you could well be in, you probably were within range of a sniper, and she was wearing fatigues and so on, and these were very dangerous times. It was extremely dangerous in 1984, in October 1984, at the Grand Hotel in Brighton. she used to say that she was lucky. Well, I think I was actually lucky on that occasion because I had flu on that day and I went home early. But anyway, at 2 a.m. approximately, on the 12th of October in Brighton, she was working in her suite of rooms with her private secretary on next day's speech. She would work and work and work all night until she was completely fatigued, have a bath and a 2-hour sleep, and then get up and deliver it. But this crazy woman in this crazy lifestyle, that's just how she lived. But anyway, she was working like that on her adrenaline and on her speech, and suddenly there was an almighty bang. And bombs, some of you may have more experience in bombs than I have, but they always, for some reason, make a sort of cracking noise. You know that there's a crack. When there's a bomb, it makes a crack. And obviously, inside the Grand Hotel, it was obviously a particular crack. And then there's a silence, and then you hear the falling masonry, so you know it's inside. Well, crack, bang. She got up. She put down her draft and her pen. She just got up and to her private secretary's horror, walked straight into the dark bedroom, the sound of all the masonry, to see that her husband was all right. If, in fact, she had been sitting in the bathroom, she might have, any sensible person would have been cleaning their teeth, about to go to bed. She was just working. If she'd been in the bathroom, she would have been dead. And she showed complete self-possession. She was only interested in whether her husband was all right, and obviously delivered her speech next day. That takes guts. In politics, you've got to have guts. You've got to have character. She believed in character. She thought that it wasn't, obviously you've got to have intelligence, you've got to work hard, you should be able to choose good advisors and so on, but in the end you've got to have character. She believed in the virtues. She sometimes spoke about the Victorian virtues. Somebody who wrote about her, and knew her, Shirley Letwin, an interesting book about Mrs. T, The Anatomy of Thatcherism, talks about the vigorous virtues. And Mrs. Thatcher in many ways represented in her whole life and her style of politics these vigorous virtues. That character really saw her through. Moral courage was required in trying to get through what most of the cabinet, not just what most of the public at the time, most of the cabinet thought was a crazy experiment in monetarism. They didn't believe in it. They wanted to obstruct it. Moral courage was required over the Falklands. And I should just say something about that. It's often suggested that it took a great deal of courage to send the task force to the Falklands. And it is quite true that if she'd listened to the advice which came from the Ministry of Defence, naturally, and the Foreign Office even more naturally, she would not have sent the task force. But I say that that was not really the proof of the courage. The courage was seeing that the task force kept en route 8,000 miles into the storm-tossed South Atlantic. That was what took courage. Then it took courage to use the task force, because all of these blowhards in the House of Commons, including even Michael Foot, one of the biggest blowhards of them all, they were all in favour of sending the task force. And let's never forget that. They were absolutely, the Union Jack was flying, Jack Tar was on the deck. We were really back to Britain until, of course, you have to spill blood, until you have to take a risk. Now, she was not somebody who had a hard heart. I mean, she feared, she wept about the loss of our troops, and she feared for the loss of these young men and the impact it would have on their families. And after all, it's a total impact. Somebody dies, well, the family, we don't know what happens to them afterwards, but certainly the family, we know that that's total loss. So she felt that, but she used the task force. And the pressure, not least, of course, pressure from the United States, but from elsewhere too, was to have our men bobbing around in this fleet, around and round and round, blockading, of all places, blockading the Falklands, as if you could actually blockade the place against Argentina, while the storms got worse, the waves grew higher, the men became more and more sick, your weapons became less reliable, and so on. Well, she didn't. She said, go ahead, take it. Take it. That took courage. Well, the legacy. Britain in 1979 was an economic basket case. It was known widely as the sick man of Europe, and we were almost as sick as the Ottomans. And we were sick to such an extent that people believed that there was nothing could be done about it. Britain could not be run without the agreement of the trade unions. It was impossible to control inflation without a prices and incomes policy. It was impossible to denationalise vast areas of British industry. It was impossible to reduce subsidies. It was impossible to compete in world markets. It was just impossible, impossible, impossible. In fact, worse actually than anything that was bad, and bad it was in the 70s, was that culture of excuses. That culture of excuses, which I think the Anglo-Saxon world specialises in somehow, but it's probably our worst enemy, even worse than Al-Qaeda. And that had to be defeated, and she believed that it was possible to defeat it, and so, of course, by our policies, we did. We denationalised, we cut taxes, we cut regulation, we did bring down inflation through controlling the money supply. We did all the things which were impossible. And as a result, Britain did reverse its economic decline. And there is no doubt about that. The left accept it. The statistics show it. I'll just give you one. And that is that in the 1970s, this is judging one economic cycle with another, so we're talking as far as the 70s is concerned, 73 to 79. If you compare that with the 80s, in the 1970s, the British economy grew by less than 1% a year on average. In the 1980s, it grew by 2.25%. Now, that may seem a very small amount, but of course, anybody who knows anything about the effect of compound interest and the J-curve effect knows that is a dramatic effect. And that was against the trend, the international trend, because world economies did not generally grow faster in the 80s than the 70s. And the basis of this was an upsurge in productivity. And the final thing I must mention, of course, is victory in the Cold War. Now, somebody who was less realistic and less modest than her might have claimed that she won the Cold War. But she didn't claim that. She didn't claim that. She said that she had played a useful role in helping Ronald Reagan, the Pope, and all the imprisoned members of the captive nations to win the Cold War. They slightly underrated, I should say, her contribution, because it was in fact large. It was very important to Reagan to have her support. And it wasn't just the fact that Britain had its upgraded nuclear deterrent, that we were spending the right amount on weaponry, that we allowed the Americans to use our bases in order to bomb Libya in 1986, and so on and so on. It was much more, I think, the moral and intellectual support that she gave Reagan on the international stage that was important. If I was to compare the two, I would say that Mrs. Thatcher was nimbler in her approach, and that Reagan was probably steadier. And I think you actually need nimbleness and steadiness if you're going to win battles in international arenas, and she provided the nimbleness. And they were very similar, of course. They were friends, they were political friends. Political friends is an odd concept. We can understand personal friends, but political friends, you have not only to like one another, but you actually have to share the similar ideological outlook, and they did. They were both outsiders. They both were real conservatives, cold warriors, committed cold warriors who hated communism and socialism. And also the Republican establishment was very wary of Reagan, let's remember that, and the Conservative Party establishment was very wary, even warier of Mrs. Thatcher. They had a lot in common. But she was different in one respect, which is important that Americans should understand. And that is that although she loved America, she loved Britain more. She was a British patriot. She loved America because she thought she understood American values and the American dream, but also because she thought that America represented in many ways the best of the long Anglo-Saxon contribution to the world. And when it really came to it, it was British national interest that mattered to her. And the clashes that she had with Reagan, sometimes he was right, sometimes she was right, are actually proof of that. We were nobody's patsy and nobody's poodle. Nor should Britain be anybody's patsy or poodle. Well, there was unfinished business by the time she left office, particularly as regards Europe. She regretted that. But I think that in those 11 and a half years, turbulent, difficult, triumphant, sometimes sad and disappointing, but in the end satisfying 11 and a half years, she did enough to justify what the crowd outside St. Paul's clearly felt, and what those who answered that opinion poll clearly felt. She justified herself with the title of the greatest modern post-war British Prime Minister. Thank you.
Robin, thanks very much for a tremendous speech. Robin, we'd now like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes or so for questions. Please do, when you ask a question, keep it brief. Do identify yourself and any institutional affiliation that you may have. If I may take the privilege of answering the opening question, Robin, the special relationship was, of course, extremely important for Lady Thatcher. What's your assessment of the current state of the special relationship with Obama and Cameron? And also, what's your assessment of current American global leadership, another issue of huge importance to Lady Thatcher? There is a lot of concern, of course, in Washington about American decline on the world stage, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Well, I don't think there's much to be said for the special relationship under President Obama and Mr. Cameron, but then I don't think, frankly, that there's a great deal to be said. Well, I won't say anything about America, but about Mr. Cameron. As a visitor to your great country, I think I shall retain some degree of discretion. But anyway, I'm afraid that neither of them, I would say, is an inspiring figure on the world stage. So consequently, in a way, the strength of the relationship is secondary. It's very important that America should have the right objectives, that America should be led by somebody whose analysis is clear and correct. Somebody, the leader of America must actually understand and believe in and love America and believe in American exceptionalism, that I would say. And similarly, as far as Britain is concerned, it's very important that, in my view, a conservative leader should be a conservative. This may be a rather old-fashioned view, but just accept it as a sort of eccentricity. But, and I'm afraid that that is not the case as regards Mr. Cameron, who is, he responds to events, but in fact he doesn't even think through events. I mean, let us take the Syrian crisis. It's possible to have two views. I mean, I'm against intervention, not because I have any sympathy for Mr. Assad, but because I think that intervention would actually make things worse, and they're quite bad enough. But however you wish to manage that question, you certainly do not do what Mr. Cameron did, which is to have a kind of brainstorm on holiday and think that he could bully the Conservative Party into accepting what had never been proposed or explained to them. So, in fact, I don't think the US-UK relationship is very good. And also, while Britain indulges in more and more defence cuts, not least actually in order to fund largely wasteful overseas aid and spend far too much on welfare and the health service, I'm afraid our priorities are wrong. So I think that's really all I have to say on that now.
Right, thank you, Robin. Take the question down here.
Hello, Barbara Bowie Whitman, and I served in the embassy in London, in the American embassy in London from February of '81 through March of '84, so it was a very interesting time. And there's one little incident that I'd like to mention. There were wonderful times and good times, and I thoroughly appreciated Lady Thatcher as Prime Minister. One fine morning I entered my office, or entered the building and walked past the ambassador's office, and his aide was standing in the hall looking very concerned. And I said, "What on earth is wrong?" And she said, "The ambassador's been summoned to number 10. Someone's invaded Barbados, and I'm afraid it's us. Can you tell me anything about the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher during those days, and how it may have been resolved?"
Well, I'm glad you did bring up that. I mean, I alluded to it, but not directly. Mrs. Thatcher felt that she had not been consulted, and she wasn't consulted. She certainly wasn't consulted in time. On the other hand, I can see exactly why the Americans didn't consult her, because she would have said no. And so I think it's much better to say, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, I thought we'd consulted you," when you're going to do it anyway. And Reagan was certainly going to do it anyway. And she felt very annoyed about this, and she also seemed to think that it was both a breach of the rule of law, which I don't think it was. She thought that it was an insult to the Queen and the Commonwealth, which I really don't think was a very serious point. As I say, she did think that she should have been consulted. She was also worried, and particularly worried at that time, and I think the Americans didn't grasp this. We were very worried about the public reaction to the stationing of cruise missiles, which was going to occur just a little later. And there was a terrific sort of battle in the press going on as to whether America could be relied on. Was America a reliable power? And this is the question as to whether there should be dual key control over these missiles. And she thought that by acting in what appeared to be this impulsive and non-consultative and indeed aggressive manner, America would have made it much more difficult for her to win that argument. Now, I think that those are quite understandable. I don't think the thing about the Queen and the Commonwealth was anything more than nonsense, but the rest of it, I think, was understandable. But I'd also say she was wrong. She never admitted she was wrong, but I think perhaps in our hearts she sort of knew in the end, because in fact Grenada has turned into an absolute success story, and if it hadn't been for Ronald Reagan, it would not have been a success story. And also, I have no doubt whatsoever that the Cubans were behind what had happened in that coup. But, of course, what she did after that, she was a very realistic person. She knew that she hadn't got anywhere over this, and so she did learn that lesson. So she piped down. And Britain sometimes has to pipe down. Britain is an important power, but we're not a great power. We stick to a few things that we can actually say to you, Americans, we are not going to do this, because it's against our national interest. But other than that, we defer to America, and that makes sense.
The gentleman right in the middle over there.
Al Milliken, AM Media. How have you evaluated actresses portraying Margaret Thatcher in film depictions?
Well, as they say, I don't know many actresses. But anyway, if we're thinking about Meryl Streep, I think she did a great job. I mean, she's very good at imitating people. I'm not sure that she would think that was the greatest tribute, but anyway, I think that it is true. And she is. She's a very good mimic. And I think that the film itself is powerful. I don't think it should have been made while Mrs. Thatcher was alive. The depiction of Mrs. Thatcher there was some truth in it. I mean, this is as regards the you remember the film itself, because it takes Mrs. Thatcher is recollecting what has happened during her life, and I think that the episodes where she's recollecting things are actually well done. I mean, some of them are historically inaccurate, and but that's just basically to increase the weepy element. And why not? For goodness sake, it's a film. And I found it very powerful, and indeed I wept. So, and I'm not one of the world's great weepers, but I wept a bit. But I think what was wrong, in two senses, was that after all, Mrs. Thatcher at that point, although she was not at all well, and she was a bit mentally confused, but she was not a cabbage. And she was looking at the television. She did not, in fact, see that. But I don't think that you should have to look at yourself and see yourself depicted as a sort of mad old hag. And I don't think either that you should see yourself imagining, and this in fact was just factually nonsense, your late husband appearing every now and again out of a broom cupboard. which again, I did think actually that did no good to the film itself. So I don't think it should have been made when it was made, but I think that Meryl Streep did a good job.
Gentleman over here.
Did Mrs. Thatcher love politics or love policy? Or both?
It's a very interesting question, as they say, which the speaker means the speaker's turning around with his mind what the answer is. Almost everybody who really goes into politics and spends any time there and is reasonably successful, I don't know that they love it. They need it. It sort of gets into their system. A drug is not quite the right way of putting it. I mean, but there is when you are in politics at a senior level, everything, you're just working 110%. All your faculties are working at 110%. It's exciting. You're living more than, I don't know, perhaps some great sportsman. I'm a completely useless sportsman. But perhaps some great sportsman, perhaps they live like this. But this terrific tension is something that you need. And she needed it. And of course, when she lost it, it broke her, really. So that's as regards politics. But she certainly was very interested in policy. And I think that the shrewdness of your question is that I think that it was both. Because often the policy wonks are not really any good at politics. And the political people are just too cynical and opportunistic to really get down to policy. But partly she was a very clever woman. She was not an intellectual. She liked being surrounded by intellectuals, but she didn't think of herself as an intellectual. But she had, I'm sure, a very high IQ. For example, she could do mental arithmetic just like that. She was very, very clever, so she could master policy quite easily. And she worked and worked and worked to do that. But she was also good at politics. So I think that she was a bit of both. And that's what made her great.
Gentleman over there.
Yes, Richard Lawless. Two quick questions, both related to the Falklands. And first, to compliment you on the quality of the presentation today and the really great narrative read of the book. It's a great read. On the Falklands, were you, and to what degree was she surprised by the lack of loyalty within the cabinet as the decisions unfolded to go to war in the Falklands? And secondly, perhaps, was she surprised, and were you surprised by the actions, machinations of some from the U.S. side, particularly then National Security Advisor Al Haig?
Well, I should explain what my position was. I was at that point in the Treasury, and very sensibly, oddly enough, following Macmillan's advice. I'd say oddly enough, I'll explain in a minute. But she kept the Treasurer, she kept the Chancellor off the War Cabinet. She set up a War Cabinet. And Macmillan, in fact, had advised her to do this. And the great paradox is that it was Macmillan who, at the time of Suez in 1956, had been Chancellor and had actually betrayed Eden, in cahoots, incidentally, with America, had betrayed the whole action. I mean, as Wilson said of Macmillan himself, first in, first out. And so, in fact, if you look into the matter, but anyway, following Macmillan's advice, she did keep Geoffrey Howe off the War Cabinet, and I was an advisor to Howe. And I'm very glad that she did, because as I explain in the book, I was really myself personally shocked at what I heard in the Treasury. It was believed that this was, by many people, I'm sure many people in the party and the cabinet, that this was an absurd distraction, the Falklands, that it was unwinnable. If it was winnable, it would cost too much. There was no sense that Britain's honour and interests in a fundamental way were at stake. This was partly because they really were keen to deal with the economic problems, and going to war is not a very good idea, if you're dealing with economic problems. But in fact, we managed the whole expenditure on the war within the existing public expenditure estimates, and I'm not even sure we even drew on the reserve. So it was extreme, but of course it could have been more expensive. Well, I was very shocked what I heard. I don't know what she thought about it at the time. I think that she knew that if something had gone wrong, if one of the carriers had been hit, if the QE2 had been sunk or anything like that, the rug would have been pulled out from her by the cabinet faster than it ever was in 1990. That's what would have happened. That would have been it. She would have gone, we would have lost, and it would now be, as Mr. Obama seems to think it actually is, Las Malvinas. And it's not Las Malvinas, just so that we can understand it. So I think she was very disappointed by Al Haig, but she thought that he was trying to do the right thing, incidentally. I mean, she never felt any animus against him. And she always thought that both he and Reagan were trying to do the right thing. But again, I think she felt that British national interests had to come first, and she knew what those were.
Good to send that message on the Falklands to Hillary Clinton as well, Robin. I shall take, actually, just one final question from this gentleman over here.
I'm David Kenny, and Falklands has been my hobby and was at one time my work. A couple of comments. During one of the suppers at which Al Haig was present at number 10 while the war was on, Pym was winning. He was about to pull the rug out from under. Al Haig took him by the elbow off into a corner and said, "You are going to win this war." That's a direct quote. "You are going to win this war." That was followed by Weinberger's offer of the second carrier. You're quite right in saying, but I don't know why you set up the proposition of Thatcher versus Haig. Haig was her greatest ally in this town. I don't know where that nonsense comes from.
Comes from her.
By the way, Moore's book is riddled with errors. The 100 pages he devotes to Falklands is just riddled with errors. The question I have is really, why did the British intelligence service let Thatcher down in that last week of March? Carrington was in Tel Aviv. The British intelligence service did not warn her. Yet on the 28th of March, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman sent 2 tankers to Ascension Island because he knew that would be the British staging base and they need fuel. But why did the British intelligence service let her down in this matter?
And that's extremely interesting, the points you've made, I mean, some of which are new to me. Well, obviously, I can't answer that because I wasn't involved in British intelligence, but certainly as regards what the documentation that I've seen shows, if the Foreign Office had been on the ball, they would have been much more worried much earlier. I don't know that it would have made a great deal of difference because it just took so long. I mean, the most important thing was actually whether we actually had a nuclear sub down in the area, and we didn't.
That didn't make any difference.
That would have made a lot of difference. Well, forgive me.
I did.
Excellent. Yeah, right. Well, may I continue? If we had had that, she would have felt much more confident, but we didn't have it, and it would have taken quite a long time to go down there. And as regards whether there was a failure in intelligence, I'm sure there was. I mean, please don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't. I mean, because clearly there was, and indeed the newspapers down in Argentina were all the headlines, I think, were actually broadcasting exactly what the government wanted to do. You know, so clearly it was a failure, and it was a failure. It was a failure, I think, mainly in the Foreign Office. But of course, I mean, I haven't seen intelligence material other than what goes through what went through the Foreign Office and Mrs. Thatcher. But she obviously was unprepared, and you're quite right about that. So obviously there was a failure of intelligence. I agree.
Right. I'm afraid I have to bring the event to a close. We've run out of time. Robin will be signing books up here on stage immediately after we end the event. And I'd like to thank Dr. Harris for a terrific presentation today, really full of tremendous insights. And we're very grateful to you, Robin, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here at Heritage. We look forward to welcome you back to the Heritage Foundation in the not-too-distant future. Thank you.